property, never went even to looked at it. I think Lee Stone over here was aware of it before I was. In fact, I probably learned of it from Lee, who was tracking Union soldiers who were buried in Loudoun County. But so we will learn something about it today. There are three threads of history that come together in the Mount Sinai Church and Cemetery. The first is the community of Britain itself. This is, it's on Mountain Road. It's south, about 2-3 miles southwest of Lovettsville on Mountain Road. And there's a road called Britain Road, which at one point was also called Fry Road. And that community was originally German settlers. Families of the names of Arnold, Krim, Fry, Grubb, Householder, Jacobs, and Painter were German families that lived in that area. And many of them lived on the mountain or on the side of the mountain. After the Civil War, it became largely a Black area, populated by former enslaved people and free Blacks. And it was that way till about the 1920s, when most of the Black families moved out of the area, probably for economic opportunity. And in fact, quite a few of them, Claudette and Gilbert's families included, went to Rockville. There seemed to be quite a cluster of people from here who were in Rockville. And that was till about the 20s, and now it's sort of a mixed area. There's some of the old families still there, a lot of newer people, newer houses. And it had been centered on a general store there, which was called at various points English's store or Arnold's store, which I think that was, in fact, they described that this was their Walmart there. And Daniel Cooper, who's a local resident who's helped us a lot with the cemetery, describes himself as the mayor of Little Britain. And it is a little, sort of a cohesive little community at this point. So that's the first thread. The second thread involves Priscilla Lewis and her son, Franklin Lewis. Priscilla Lewis was a free Black before the Civil War in Lovettsville, property owner, had in the 1860 census, it was before the war, had real property of $200, and which is not bad in those days, and personal property of 100, and was living with 5 children, her family. Her occupation was a washerwoman, and so she had her own business, her own property, and family. And one of her children was Franklin Lewis. I think it's after the war, she shows up. She owns the property. For those of you familiar with the town here, Mayor Hickman's house, which is the house that's in front of the museum. Across the street from Brainiac's, there's a vacant lot there next to that. And that was lot number 1, the way that the town was laid out. And she owned that property, and then it stayed in her family. I don't remember the year right now, but for many decades. Her son, Franklin, was her youngest child. He was educated in the public schools, which, Virginia was one of the last in the Union to have public schools, but they started around 1870. And there were a number of schools in the area here, of course, designated white and colored. But he went to those, and then he went to Storer College, or what became Storer College, and was there for a couple of years, and was ordained as a minister in 1885. And he was, you could say, the founder of Mount Sinai Church. The third thread is the Free Will Baptist from New England. And this is what makes Mount Sinai quite unique compared to other Black churches in the area, or even in the county. Free Will Baptists were, in fact, my wife's, one of her ancestors was a Free Will Baptist in Maine. They were abolitionists And during the Civil War, they sent people down into the South to open schools and churches for newly freed enslaved persons. The Nathan Brackett, who's the key person for our purposes, was an agent for the U.S. He was a Free Will Baptist, also was an agent for the U.S. Christian Commission, which was a charitable group operating. There were two. There was the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the U.S. Christian Commission, were civilian charitable groups that worked with the Union Army during the Civil War. He came to Harpers. He was working under Phil Sheridan, and he went to Harpers Ferry and was conducting missionary work there. And so he opened a teacher's college there, which eventually became Storer College. It was intended to be a multiracial school and college, a normal school, and it was a teacher training school. But being West Virginia, very quickly, there were no whites who wanted to attend it, so it became an all-black institution. And it was a very important school. That's a whole nother story. We had a lecture on that a couple of years ago by Guinevere Roper from the National Park Service, who's one of the people that did a lot of history of that. It closed in 1955, right after Brown versus Board of Education. Some people think quite unnecessarily, but nonetheless, it was closed down at that time. So they did both the school there and opened up mission points around the area. And there were in the Harpers Ferry, what became known as the Harpers Ferry Quarterly Meeting. Sounds like the Quakers, right? The quarterly meeting of the Free Will Baptists. They had about half a dozen congregations in Jefferson County, now West Virginia. Lovettsville was the only one in Loudoun County. And then two, I think, in Maryland, one of which was in Pleasant Valley, which, if people know, is in Washington County, right on the way to Harpers Ferry. From here, you intersect Route 67 going north, which is Pleasant Valley Road. And this was Mount Moriah Free Will Baptist Church, which still exists today. I tried getting in contact with them to see if I could find out anything about Mount Sinai, and I was not successful in doing. I made contact, but they didn't have any records. So what looks like what happened is that Franklin Lewis was a student there and probably invited, they asked him one way or another, decided to open up a mission point in Loudoun County. And that was done at Little Britain. So that began in 1883, when they began to form the congregation and made plans to construct a building. He was not a pastor at the time. There was another pastor who was there who died, I think, in 1885, which was about the time they began construction on the church. And so Franklin Lewis became the pastor, not only senior pastor, but the only pastor of the church. As with many churches at that time, and I think even still today, they wouldn't dedicate the church until the debt was paid, right? So they raised money to build it in this area, and this becomes important in light of what happened later on, that it was locally financed. And at the dedication, well, the Loudoun Telephone reported a lot of the way we know this is from the Loudoun Telephone newspaper. This was a Republican newspaper, or it's Republican, not today's Republicans, but Lincoln Republicans, in an overwhelmingly Democratic or, secessionist county. So it was a pretty unique paper, and it's very interesting to read on economic issues and everything. But they had every couple of months, they'd have a story about Mount Sinai. And there's much more there than you can find out anyplace else about the history of that. So they say in 1883, they reported, quote, "The colored people have organized a Baptist congregation of Lovettsville and purchased land from J.W. Goodhart." Well, they actually didn't get it from J.W. Goodhart. He was the Goodhart of the Lovettsville Goodharts and the funeral home and everything else. But they built on land owned by the Cooper family. And the cornerstone was laid in 1885. And they had people from Baltimore, other places, Harpers Ferry here. And they described it in the paper that said, through the tireless efforts of Reverend Frank Lewis, whose whole life seems to be consecrated to the work, they have been able to build a commodious little chapel on the sloping side of the mountain. So this is the Loudon telephone. If I said telegraph, I was wrong. It's telephone speaking. And the land that was owned by Adam Cooper and his wife Mary, they transferred the land to probably a daughter or niece, I'm not sure which, in 1886. So this is while the church was being built. And obviously the church is not back, hidden somewhere in the woods. It's right on the corner, the main intersection in the area. So they clearly knew it was there and supported it. And then it stayed in the Cooper family for many years, even though it was occupied by the church, which was dedicated in 1887. And then also a school, as was customary, that all the churches had schools attached to them. The dedication was reported again in the Loudon Telephone in October 1887. And this is the article. It sounds like an editorial, but it's actually, well, it's a news article, I guess a signed news article. It said, Mount Sinai Free Will Baptist Church was dedicated to the Lord free of debt on Sunday, October 23rd, 1887. And then it goes through the services. Professor Brackett, Nathan Brackett of Storr College, he opened it. You had the choir there, a choir by the congregation led by the choir director from Storr College, another Storr College official, a sermon, singing. They collect a collection of $25. And they say that we can say our little church valued at $700 is without debt. And we do sincerely return thanks to the good people of Shinar and Lovettsville neighborhoods for their liberality in giving us money and materials to erect this house of the Lord. For it looks as though they were taking a great interest in this glorious work, which is intended to promote the happiness of our community and the advancement of the Redeemer's kingdom. This is written actually by Franklin Lewis. Shinar is the community which now sort of near Morrisonville. It's about, I don't know, maybe half a mile south of Britton Road is Morrisonville Road. And Shinar, the Lutheran church there was known as Shinar Lutheran Church. It's now called Zion. So that's the community he's referencing, and then Lovettsville. So we don't know. I've looked through the records of the Lutheran Church to see if there's any mention of contributing money to this, and didn't see any. But obviously they were raising money in the area for this. We don't know exactly from whom. So that's 1887. And then from that point on, it's a school. The cemetery begins in, the first burial there is in 1887, which you'll hear about from Claudette. And I'm sorry, I neglected to mention that the two people, once I stop talking, will be Claudette Bard and Gilbert Timbers, who was online. We'll be talking about specific access and the people there. Yeah, I'll get to it. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Don't worry. Okay. Thank you for reminding me that it was time to move it. So Franklin Lewis, as I went through it. So he was the son of Priscilla Lewis, educated at Storr College. He brought the Free Will Baptists into Loudon in 1883, became a minister and led the construction of the church. Now here's Nathan Brackett. He's a Free Will Baptist. He was the guy who was down here first and was working with the U.S. Christian Commission. He was the founder, first president of Storr College. And as I said, he spoke at the dedication service for Mount Sinai Church in 1887. This is the only, well, there's one other picture we've heard about of the church, but we don't have it. Haven't seen it. This is what the church building looked like Yeah, that's coming up.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
In probably the 60s or 70s, by which time it had been abandoned. You can still get an idea of it from this. It burned, or actually was burned, in about 1980. There's various stories, but the most credible seems to be that there was a homeless person who was living in the building and accidentally was building a fire to keep himself warm and accidentally burned the church down. We have heard from some of the neighbors. In fact, Daniel Cooper, who I mentioned, used to play, they would play hide and seek and so forth around the building when he was a child. And he's one of the people that's told us that there were grave markers, in the whole area up to right next to the church. Because as you'll see today, there's only a small area where there are grave markers that exist. Just this is an old map of Loudon from, I think, 1926. What's marked L there is Britain Road. Running north-south is Mountain Road, and the arrow points to, it says Colored Church, and that's where Mount Sinai was and is still the location. There's a tax map of the county. Again, the green tract is the tract on which is now the Mount Sinai tract. It was all this, that one next to it on the right, that was all one property up until about 1948. Now here you get an idea of, this was taken in the late winter of 2019, after the property had been cleared by a neighbor and a number of the trees cut down. So you can see here on the right side where you see those big white boulders, that's the area where the only gravestones that we know of are in that area. Over on the left side, you'll see like 3 parallel rows of stones. Can you all see those? Just where the edge of the darker green area. That's what's left of the church foundation. So that was the church there. And then probably that whole area over to where the existing burial ground is today were all burials there. We've been told by some of the neighbors that there could be up to 100 burials there. We have, when we started out there, the county had originally identified 9 headstones. We now have 12, and we've documented largely through Claudette's work, death certificates and other obituaries and other family histories and things, about 30 people who were buried there. So there's still many, many more to go. That's just another closer up from the aerial. These are the county's aerial photos of the burial area. We'll show you some ground shots of that. Now, we call this Lovettsville's hidden history, right? This is what it looks like in summer. You drive by there and you don't have a clue that there's anything there.
Yeah.
And in fact, that church foundation is you're looking at it, right? That's where it is. And you see this church sign, that's Britain Road. You see Mountain Road on the far left, going north from there. So yes, it really is hidden. I'll get to how this happened later on, but this is a hog pen, the remains of a hog pen. The existing owner was in a dispute with a neighbor. He's in a dispute with everybody. And he had built a hog pen on that property, probably over graves, to annoy the neighbors. And that is, even though he had promised to remove it, that's still there. And we're at a different stage now with the county, which I'll go into in a minute, but that will not be there much longer, we hope. This is a view in winter of a year ago, a little more than a year ago. You see it's a lot easier to see things. That's the foundation, what's left of the church foundation. And one of the things that we would like to see happen, and a neighbor was very interested in doing, would be to actually rebuild the church building or build a replica of the church building. So that's a ways down the road, but that's something that is a possibility in the future. That's again, that's a corner of the foundation. This is what it looked like, I guess, after. No, this is not us. This is what it looked like in 2019, after this neighbor had cleared the property. And those markers, we've found one or two others. You can see what kind of, at least that's what's left. This is what it normally would look like. That's what it looked like before we did the cleanup a year ago. How did I get that?
So,
Well, that's just, that slides in the wrong place because of our
okay.
snafu here. I didn't get the slideshow in perfect order. Again, that's a closer view of the burial area. In the upper left-hand corner there, the grave with the flag, that's Private Samuel Timbers, which we will hear about in a couple of minutes. Okay, I'm going to cut back off of this here and have Claudette go ahead at this point.
So you're gonna stop sharing.
Yeah, how do I? Very good. We'll come back, maybe I'll come back to these later on.
Okay.
Uh-oh, I gotta plug in. Never mind. So Claudette is a board member of the Lovettsville Historical Society. She is a genealogist, a lot of experience and training in that, right? And
Yes.
has done some really excellent work in tracing down the families who were buried here. So Claudette Bard, go ahead. Ready?
Yes. Like Ed mentioned, I'm Claudette Lewis Bard. Just a short biography. I'm a member of the board member of the Lovettsville Historical Society since 2018. I'm a Maryland native. I was born and raised in Rockville, and my husband and I live in the Baltimore County with our two dogs, Roxy and Raven. My connection to Lovettsville is my ancestors on my mother's side lived, worked, and are buried here. And I recognize many of the surnames of those interred at Mount Sinai Cemetery, and many appear on my family tree. Most are most likely related to me by marriage. So that's just a short bio. So what I'm going to talk about today, just honoring those interred at Mount Sinai Cemetery. Like Ed mentioned, we have discovered maybe 30 burials there documented. Some gravestones appear, some of them do not. And I believe the neighbor says something about Daniel Cooper said there may be 80 to 100 people buried there, souls buried there. So I'm going to talk about just some of the more distinctive gravestones that are there, the ones that are very clear. When we started this project, I saw the gravestones. I've been out there looking at the gravestone and did research and was just curious about the lifestyle of the Little Britain neighborhood. So I started to do research of some of those buried there, some of the ones, especially the gravestones that you could read. And I got more curious, and it ended up being a quite a large project because the databases are showing more people there than the gravestone, the visible gravestones that are there. So it got to be quite of a lengthy project, but I want to talk about some of the people buried there because it kind of, to me, it kind of puts a, it makes you know how the lifestyle of the people of Little Britain, of this once African-American neighborhood. Maria E. Curtis. One of the most legible and distinctive gravestones of Mount Sinai Cemetery is Maria E. Curtis. What you first notice is a hand pointing down and it's holding a broken chain. When I researched it, it symbolized the death of a family member. And there's a break in the marriage or perhaps a break in the motherhood. Maria was only 41 years old when she died. And when she died, her children were 12 and 14 years old. The inscription at the bottom reads, "Sleep on, mother, and take thee rest. God called you home, he thought it best." Again, this is one of the more distinctive ones, and you can read it very, very clear, and it's been there since 1914, as you can see. The Paris family. These are images of the gravestones of the Paris family, where we found 3 generations of family buried side by side. We're not sure if they were actually buried that way. The grave markers may have been moved. Hetty Paris, one of the earliest burials we could find, was most likely the mother of J. William Paris. Also, there are gravestones of her son, J. William Paris, and his wife, Louisa. Their children are Anne America Paris Bird, John Ebenezer Paris, John Ebenezer Paris, and Georgina Paris. Okay, making sure, okay. J. William and Louisa had other children, and it's unknown if any more are interred at Mount Sinai. We just don't know. As I mentioned, Hetty is one of the earliest burials that we could find. She was most likely born enslaved, and she remained at her former slave master's residence until her death in 1888. Another bit of information about J. William Paris is he and his sons registered to vote in Lovettsville in the late 19th century. So one of his sons, you can see John Ebenezer Paris, was registered to vote, as well as he had a son named Edgar. There was another son, Edward, I think it was. But he took his children to register to vote in the late 19th century. Alice L.B. Morgan. We have discovered about 30 burials there, and there were at least 7 who were children who never saw their first birthdays. Pictured here is a grave and footstone of Alice L.B. Morgan. On the headstone, it is inscribed, "An angel goes home." She was the daughter of James and Annie Morgan, and through research, it doesn't appear the couple had any more children after Alice. So that was a sad part about looking through these death certificates. There were quite a few children. An early civil rights leader. The gravestone of Henry and his wife Elizabeth lay side by side at Mount Sinai Cemetery. And as I mentioned before, you find out in looking at researching these families, and you kind of get an idea of what life was like in Little Britain. This man here is an early civil rights leader. Henry Howard was an early civil rights leader in Lovettsville. In May of 1883, he was one of the 17 African-American men from Mount Loudoun County who gathered in Leesburg and held what is known as the Colored Mass Meeting, where they decided to petition the courts for recognition of their rights under the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They petitioned Judge James McCabe for their rights to serve as jurors and election officials, which were rights guaranteed them by those 2 amendments. The position of election official was a very important position at that time. I don't think it is now, but it was at that time, a very important position. These brave civil rights pioneers took this action despite the threat of being jailed or lynched, because lynching was not outlawed and allowed until 1928. The court's response was as follows, and I quote, "Judge McCabe granted all of the above petition except the right to being judges of elections." Nevertheless, a few years later, after the mass meeting and despite the disappointing outcome, Henry Howard exercised his right to vote by registering on July 24th, 1888 in Lovettsville. He was 54 years old. He and these courageous men made life a little better for the Black citizens of Lovettsville and Loudoun County. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I hit the button. But that's Henry Howard. Sorry about that. So sorry. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Another distinctive gravestone is that of Martha Young. From all accounts, she is the mother of Luther M. Young. Her gravestone has the image of the gates of heaven opening up to receive her soul. At rest is inscribed above the gates. Luther M. Young led a life dedicated to his community and to his faith. He registered to vote in Lovettsville in 1899, but this right was squashed when in 1902, Virginia adopted a new constitution that restricted voting rights of Virginia's Black as well as poor white citizens by instilling a literacy test, and a poll tax. Nevertheless, by the 1930s, Mr. Young paid his poll tax, which removed one obstacle in his quest to exercise his right to vote. He was one of 7 African-American men in Lovettsville on a listing of those who paid the poll tax. We found a listing at the Bouch Library, and it listed all the citizens who had paid the poll tax in the 1930s, and he was one of 7 African-American men. In September of 1947, Luther M. Young, sometimes called Martin Luther Young, and Luther Evans were appointed trustees of the Mount Sinai Free Will Baptist Church. The following year, in May 1948, a deed was executed conveying the property to Mr. Evans and Mr. Young. Sadly, Mr. Young died a little more than a year later on December 5th of 1949. Kate Redmond. Kate Redmond's life was cut short at age 45. Cause of death was homicide. According to newspaper accounts, on November 21st, 1914, Mason Redmond came to the Filler Farm, now Linden Hall Farm, still there, which is located near Lovettsville, and allegedly killed Kate Redmond, who was described in the newspaper as either, quote, his wife or his mistress. She was viciously shot in front of her 2 daughters. She succumbed to her wounds and died November 24th, 1914. Mason was captured immediately, taken to Leesburg, and was subsequently found guilty of first-degree murder in February of 1915. He was 21 years old. He was spared the death penalty and sentenced to quote, penitentiary for the balance of his life. We surmise that he was spared the death penalty because he was convicted of killing a Black woman. For some unknown reason, and maybe because of the diagnosis of mental illness, in 1924, he was transferred to Central State Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia, which is Dinwiddie County, which at that time, like many of Virginia's institutions, was segregated, and his patients were African-American. The patient suffered from various ailments, including mental illness. He remained there until his death in 1953. These are just some of the sources that I use. Census records, various census records, the list of colored registered voters, Lovettsville precinct, that was courtesy of the Lovettsville Historical Society. Donna Bohanna wrote a study of civil rights of the mass meeting in the Bulletin of Loudoun County History 2019 edition. So that talked about Henry Howard. The poll tax list we found, Ed and I found in the the Thomas Bouch Library one day, and there's a listing of the people, Lovettsville residents who pay poll taxes. This was 1930, so there were women and men, of course, listed on the list, and as well as 7 African-American men, but there were a lot more white citizens, of course. Newspaper articles where I got the story about Kate Redmond, historical records, Loudoun.gov, and birth and death certificates from Loudoun County is where I got my research. And that's the end of my presentation about those interred at Mount Sinai Cemetery. And let me stop the share. Okay. The next person we're going to introduce is Gilbert Timbers. So we're going to get, you can hear me, Gilbert, right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can start sharing your
Share the screen.
Yes.
And okay, so I go over
We're
here.
gonna, oh. Okay, very good. Okay.
I need to get this stuff off the top, but I'm not sure how to do that.
Okay.
But anyway, let's see.
I think you can
So if I-
click where it says slideshow across the top. We don't see it here, but maybe.
let's see.
You know there's one at the
Oh,
bottom.
not here.
The three little dots at,
Yeah, I see more.
yeah.
Oh, maybe over here. Oh,
No.
I see.
Yeah, expand, is it,
And that. Well, now that's
no, that's, no. Yeah, try that. I think it says slideshow there. No? No, okay, okay. Yeah,
PowerPoint. Download.
yeah, you have to go to PowerPoint to expand, so. Yeah,
He's in a download document, it looks like.
okay,
yeah. I downloaded it and I had it open.
okay,
So
okay.
Well, it's okay.
Okay, yeah, you can just go to each slide as, just,
Okay.
yeah, that's fine. We can see it though.
okay,
So we can see it.
okay,
Dad,
yeah.
Jaden said you have to go to the Google Drive and present it from there. You have to go through
Jaden.
the Google Drive and present it through there.
Go through the Google Drive and present it through there, but will it come through the Zoom if I do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
Teenagers.
You can really,
Young people to the rescue.
I think you can leave it like it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I better leave it. I know what I've got right now. I better
Yeah, you
leave
can
it
just
right
go to
there.
each slide on the
Okay.
left side.
Okay,
Okay,
all right.
okay, thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk now about some of the Timber family members who are buried at Mount Sinai Cemetery. I'm going to specifically talk about Samuel, who was a Civil War veteran, Emory, who is a great uncle of mine, and Ruth, who is a sister. So I'm going to share some information about each of these individuals. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Howard Gilbert Timbers, Jr. I was born and raised in Loudoun County, Virginia. I left the area after graduating from Loudoun Valley High School and joined the Air Force in July of 1968. So today I'm going to talk about my family members. I still have connections to the area. I've got sisters and brothers and numerous cousins and relatives who live in the area, live in the Percival area, the Leesburg area, Maryland. Actually, my sister and her husband are joining us today from Westminster, Maryland. But Samuel Benjamin Timbers is I'm a fifth generation descendant of him. And he was a member of the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry. And I'm going to talk more about him, my great uncle, Reverend Emory Timbers, and my sister, Ruth. Samuel Benjamin Timbers. He was born 1848 in Loudoun County, Virginia, as a free Black child. He was able to read and write and probably attended the school in Great Britain or Little Britain that also served as the church. His mother was Anne Maria Timbers, and she was one of 11 children of Margaret and Charles Timbers, Margaret being my great, 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 great grandmother. His father was Elijah Nelson. And in the 1860 census for Loudoun County, Samuel, at age 12, was living in the household of Daniel Householder as a farm laborer. And when I think about, you know, what it must have been like for a 12-year-old young man to be living away from home and living with another family at the young age of 12 is just, it's bizarre. On October the 17th, 1864, Samuel left the householder farm where he worked and found his way to Baltimore, Maryland, and he joined the Army. Interesting, if these dates are correct, Samuel would have been about 16 years old rather than 18 years old, as his enlistment records reflect.
Mhm.
You know, I find this a little interesting because his actual documents, his enlistment documents record his age at 18, but it appears as though he was 2 years younger than that. His enlistment document described him as being free, dark complexion, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, with black hair and black eyes. Now, many of my relatives, uncles, are much taller than 5 feet 6 inches. So I found it a little odd that, you know, he was much shorter than many of us. Myself, I'm 5'11". I'm just curious, you know, that's kind of short, but you know, he decided to go into the Army and you know, he served his country. His unit was dispatched to the Richmond, Virginia area, and in December of 1864, Private Timbers, who is now a member of the Army, he became ill, and he was admitted to the hospital in Pointer Rocks, Virginia, near Richmond, Virginia, where he remained for 2 months. We really don't know the nature of his illness, but you know, what I do know is that, you know, many of the soldiers who were in the Civil War, many died from diseases such as pneumonia, diarrhea, typhoid fever, and dysentery. Many more died from those illnesses than actual battle wounds. So, you know, I'm still trying to find out the nature of Private Timbers' illness. In February of 1865, he was released from the medical care, and he was detached from his company. You know, keep in mind, he had been in the hospital for 2 months. So he was released from the hospital and detached from his company, and he was reassigned to the quartermaster department at divisional headquarters as a teamster with the divisional wagon train. Now, life as a teamster is no fun job. You know, as a member of this unit, his job was both dirty and dangerous. Primarily, he was responsible for transporting equipment and supplies, you know, to the soldiers. You know, if you imagine what the terrain must have been like in the 1800s, it's rough. You know, I'm sure that, you know, being on a wagon or transporting equipment and goods was no easy task. He also was responsible for caring for the horses and the mules. And as a general rule, teamsters were not armed. So, you know, you imagine someone transporting equipment. You know, there are cases where, you know, they may have been approached by Confederate soldiers, and unfortunately he wasn't. But sometimes, if he traveled as part of a wagon train, there may have been, some infantry folks that would have provided some protection. Now, as a member of a Teamster or as a Teamster, it's likely that Private Timbers wasn't involved in any actual conflict or any fighting. But again, at any point in time, as he's transporting equipment and supplies, he could have been approached and or injured. When Private Timbers fell ill in December of 1864, the Army of James, which he had previously been a part of, was comprised of units from the Department of Virginia and North Carolina. But they formed two corps. They formed the 24th and the 25th, which was black, the 24th being white. Pardon?
I see it, but they also have it in glass. Yes, they have it in glass.
Was that a question or?
Hold on. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm gonna ask this gentleman real quick. Did you find it up there?
Lisa, can you go on mute? I think. Okay.
Got it. Okay, thanks. So you said you saw it over there? Oh, okay. Well, he said it was down here.
Okay,
Okay.
we got it.
Okay.
Okay. So as I was saying, when Private Timbers fell ill, the Army of James, which was composed of units from the Department of Virginia and North Carolina, they formed two corps. They formed the 24th, which was white soldiers, and the 25th, which was all black soldiers. So Private Timbers' unit now was part of the 25th, and his unit was actually involved in fighting some of the Confederates in the trenches in and around Petersburg. And actually, corps from both of those units, the 24th and the 25th, were some of the first soldiers to reach Petersburg and Richmond on April the 3rd, 1865. There was intense fighting by the 24th on the 9th of April, 1865, with Robert E. Lee. And as you know how the story ends, he was forced to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on that day. It's very likely that Private Timbers' unit was present for this historic event, since there were members of the 25th at Appomattox on that day. After General Lee's surrender, members from the 24th and the 25th Corps were deployed to Texas as an occupation force guarding the border and watching for resurgent Confederate activity. They actually set sail for Brazos, Texas, but on the way they encountered stormy weather, which forced them to land in Galveston, Texas, sometime between June the 18th and the 20th. We have confirmation in some of the documentation that we have discovered that Private Timbers' unit was in Galveston, Texas on June the 19th. So when General Granger notified the enslaved folks there, it's likely that Private Timbers was there. And it's also very possible that he may have been one of the Black troops who shared the information with the enslaved that they were now free. So, I found that to be quite interesting, knowing that, it's possible that I've got a descendant who was part of that historic event, which has now become known as Juneteenth. Private Timbers was honorably discharged on November the 6th, 1865, from Brownsville, Texas. He returned to Lovettsville in the area that he had grown up in. We noticed that he was enumerated in a multi-generational family household with his aunt, Margaret. He was listed in the 1870 census along with her. And that was a household that had 17 people, in one house, which is quite remarkable. He resumed work as a farm laborer. And on July the 23rd, 1870, at age 22, he marries Julia Ann Spriggs, and they raised 6 children. We also noted and found out that Private Timbers and his wife were treated by Dr. James A. Willard, who was actually a doctor who had served in the Civil War, who had returned to the Lovettsville area. I don't know if the treatment that he received was related in any way to his illness, but I thought that was interesting that both he and his wife were treated by that physician. In the 1880 census, Private Timbers and his wife Julie and children are listed as living in a rented home in Little Britain. And they're still in the same vicinity as his aunt and uncle, Thomas Henry Timbers, who is my great-grandfather. Private Timbers applied for and was awarded his Civil War pension on June 13th, 1892. The information after the 1800s becomes a little sketchy for Private Timbers. I haven't been able to locate anything for him with regards to the 1900 census. However, in 1910, he's living in the Lovettsville area. He's renting a home, he's living alone, and he's a widower. So apparently sometime between when he applied for his pension, his wife passed, and he's now living alone. He died on January 11th, 1912 at the age of 64 and was buried in Mount Sinai Cemetery. I have not been able to locate his death certificate, so that's something that I'm still trying to do. He did have children. His son Joseph married Martha Elizabeth Johnson in December 1911, and they raised 7 children. Joseph and his family lived in the Leesburg area, and he was actually able to purchase a home on Royal Street through his employment at the Lime Quarry, which was located in Leesburg. His wife cooked for a private family. Joseph died on June the 5th, 1948 at age 65, and his wife died July the 17th, 1970. These are 2 photos of the African American Civil War Museum in Washington, D.C. I received this through Claudette, who actually visited the museum, but it's a museum of African Americans who served in the Civil War. And on the right there, you can see that Samuel Timbers' name is etched in the on that ledge. This next slide is a Corps badge emblem, and this is what he would have worn on his uniform that designated that he was in the 25th Corps. I continue to look and research the life for Private Timbers, and I continue to look for, any living relatives. We have learned from a neighbor who lives near the cemetery that for several years, an elderly Black man would visit the grave of Private Timbers. While we have no idea who it was, I can only suspect that, the visitor was likely one of his grandchildren who would come to pay, his respects to his grandfather. I wish there was some way I could find out who that person was, if he's still living, so that I could, get in touch with him. But I found that to be quite interesting that, his tombstone was there at the cemetery in Mount Sinai, and there was actually someone who came to pay their respects. I'm going to switch now to another relative of mine, Emory Franklin Timbers, who grew up in the Little Britain area. He was born November the 20th, 1909 in Loudoun County, Virginia. He was the seventh child of my great grandmother and grandfather, great grandmother, James Robert Timbers and Moffett and Hogan. Emory received his early education attending the colored school, which, as you know, served as the church. He shared a very close relationship with his mother, and he regularly worked alongside her, washing clothes, ironing, cooking, baking, and sewing. And when I think of, that relationship, I just think of him, probably as a mama's boy. And, but he was very close to his mother. He enjoyed fishing in the local ponds, and I learned that he was actually baptized in the same creek that he fished in. My great-grandmother was a staunch for, attending church. And she made sure that all of her children got up on Sunday morning and attended church. And she felt that, hey, if you were not sick, or if you didn't have anything else to do on Sunday, your butt was going to be in church with her. And she made sure that all of her children got to church. And I think this really contributed to the profession that Emory would later take up as an adult, because you will see in my presentation just how that early influence, that early religious indoctrination impacted his life. In 1927, James and Martha relocated their family to Rockville, Maryland. I suspect where the opportunities were better for employment, the wages were much higher, and the living conditions were much better. His father was actually able to earn enough money to build his own home. However, he must have been somewhat of a strong, or he wanted to make sure that his family stayed intact. So he made sure that all of his children were expected to live home until they were 21. And if they were able to find jobs, they were required to support the household. And by the time they turned 21, he felt that they had learned enough and perhaps had saved enough that they were now able to live out and live independently. But until you were 21, you were supposed to live under your father's home and contribute to the household. Emory was married twice. He was employed at a local paint factory in Maryland, where he worked for 43 years. He was inducted into the United States Army on March the 31st, 1944, and he served in both the European and the Pacific theaters. Actually, while he was in the Philippines, he taught his first Sunday school class. Upon his discharge, Emory resumed his religious study and at the First Baptist Church in Kingston, Maryland. On April the 14th, 1949, he was licensed to preach by Reverend Isaac Gray. And on July the 2nd, 1951, he was ordained and he served as an assistant pastor at the Greater St. Paul Church. Emory was an avid fisherman, and the story has that he generally fished at least 2 days a week in and around the Maryland area. I've also learned that he loved to fish in the Chesapeake Bay, and he was responsible, and he took it upon himself that whenever his church had a fish fry, he would make sure that they had enough fish for that event. He actually received several citations for some of his catches. As you see in my presentation, he was recognized by the governor for a 24-pound rockfish. He was something else. And it's interesting because when I learned about, his love for fishing, the whole Timbers, we love to fish. And my brother, who's in Texas, is an avid fisherman. My dad was an avid fisherman, and we spent, as a child, many nights on the Potomac River fishing for catfish. So this fisherman lives on in the Timbers family today. Emory also enjoyed recording weather temperatures and measuring rain and snowfall. So he had a knack for meteorology. Life is always, includes some misfortune. And in May 1987, he lost his son, who was 55 years old, who was the victim of a homicide in Washington. And if that wasn't enough, Reverend Timbers collapsed while preaching as a pastor at Greater St. Paul Baptist Church. He was 82 years old, and he collapsed on May the 19th, 1991. His second wife, Madeline, passed away December the 2nd, 2012, at the age of 87. I never knew my great uncle. I knew of him, but when I think about him, I think back to the Lovettsville area and what he was able to learn in that area and what he was able to take away from it, and how it influenced his life in his later life. The third member is, a hole in my heart that is just, it's just a hole in my heart, because through my research, I learned that I had a sister that was buried at Mount Sinai Cemetery. She was one of 8 children of Howard Gilbert Timbers Sr. and my mom, Gertrude Virginia Furr. She was born July the 5th, 1953. She died July the 10th, 1953, and the cause of death was hemorrhagic. I believe I'm pronouncing that, but she died of yellow jaundice. And, what I remember about her, I was only maybe 6 or 7 years old when she passed away, but I remember my dad carrying her small body out of the house that we were renting. I often wondered what happened to her, but, when I did my research, I found out that she passed away. But her death certificate reflects that she was buried in the colored cemetery in Lovettsville by the Brown Funeral Home. So we suspect that she's buried there at Mount Sinai, although we haven't been able to locate her actual burial. So there you have it. 3 members of the Timbers family: Private Timbers, Reverend Emory, Franklin Timbers, and Ruth Ann Timbers.
Okay, so you can stop sharing. You can, so you're going to stop sharing, Gilbert?
Yeah.
Stop share, okay. And you want to bring up your.
Okay, I have a few more things to say, but I'll wait a few minutes. We can take some question and answer. We can, if you're online, do it through the chat function. And if you're here, I think it will work best, given what happened last time, if you come up to the podium here and speak into that, ask a question in that microphone there.
Mhm.
It's our custom here. We don't charge admission to these lectures, but we do pass the hat. And today we have a literal hat, which Nancy will pass around the room.
Okay.
And as always, be generous, please. Your gift will be appreciated. Yes, sir. Press the button on the microphone there, on the lower row, the button on the right. If you press that, a red light goes on. Doesn't sound like it's
Oh,
on.
no,
Is the red light on there?
it is, okay. No, it's not. Red lights on? No, no.
Well, here, we maybe wanted to come up.
Yeah, would you mind coming up and speak? Yeah, okay.
My question is, are there any plans to use ground penetrating radar on the cemetery to locate some of these lost graves?
Very good question. Yes, there are. Where we stand right now is that the Board of Supervisors, at the initiative of Chair Phyllis Randall and Caleb Kirshner, who's the Catoctin District Supervisor, brought what's called a board member initiative to the board in November, I believe it was, which is asking the county to take steps to restore and preserve that cemetery. That was referred to county staff by the board in November, and we expect there has been a task force within the county, the Department of General Services, the Department of Planning, I think is maybe not as involved as it should be, but I think is involved. And who else, Lori? Yeah, it's some other department is involved. Anyway, I've spoken to them a couple times. What they are, I don't want to tip their hand before they present it, but the idea is that they will, the county would acquire the cemetery from the owner, take steps to restore it, the cemetery, and then possibly hand it over to a nonprofit organization such as the Lovettsville Historical Society. The county does not want to be in the cemetery business and set a precedent of owning and operating cemeteries. So part of the restoration work would include ground penetrating radar. Now, I mean, that's not guaranteed that's going to happen, but the county has done that before in other cemeteries. It's somewhat expensive, as you probably know, to do, but it's that, and there's certain types of probing that can also be done if you're done professionally by people who know what they're doing, and the ground penetrating radar. So we would hope to do that or have that done so that we could discover other graves, because that's a very important part of this, is to determine the extent of the burials in that cemetery, because we have reason to believe that there's many, many more than we know about right now. And all those people should be known, should be respected, should be honored. So that would be a step in that direction. And so hopefully if it comes back as scheduled, we will have an idea of the county staff recommendations at the Board of Supervisors business meeting on April 19th. Hi, Judy, why don't you go up and use this one?
Mm.
What do we know about the family that donated the property for the church and cemetery?
The Coopers?
Mm-hmm.
Judy asked about what do we know about the family that donated the land? They didn't technically donate it, but they certainly allowed it to be used. And it was the same as donating. No, they were white. They were members of New Jerusalem Lutheran Church. The woman who, Adam Cooper, he was older. He had been around in the Revolutionary War period. The woman who we donated it to, I don't believe it was his daughter, but she had just gotten married. And it possibly was a marriage present to her. She married I don't have his name in front of me right now, but the property stayed in the family for many, many years. So obviously they supported the church and it was quite prominent in the property, right? But I can't tell you a whole lot more about them, but that's what I do know. Thanks for the question. That sort of raises the question of how did the church end up in private hands or end up in a situation we're in now where it's in really adverse private hands. It's stayed in the Cooper family and then I think some others up until 1948 when the church, not exactly sure who initiated this, but the pastor of I mentioned the Free Will Baptist Church, Mount Moriah in Pleasant Valley. It's around the Yarrowsburg, what's it called? Brownsville, is it? Okay, Brownsville and Garrett's Mill. I think it's on Garrett's Mill Road in Washington County. What we have in some court papers is that the pastor there came down and got some people together and held what they called a congregational meeting, even though the congregation hadn't existed for 20 some years at that point. This is 1947. Now at this meeting, this was, apparently done in good faith because they had two people, Luther Evans, who Claudette talked about, and Martin Luther Young. Actually, you talked about both of them.
Yes.
They were, the church designated them as trustees, appointed them as trustees. And Ruth Evans, was Ruth Evans, Timbers Evans, I believe, was designated as the clerk for that meeting. So they went into court and petitioned to get title to the property. They published an ad and was required a legal ad in the papers for legal notice for 4 weeks, saying that the church had used the property continuously for more than 50 years, had possession of it, there was no deed of record, and therefore they asked for the appointment of a special commissioner to transfer the property to the trustees. The court did this, and in fact, and then the property was conveyed to Mr. Young and Mr. Evans as trustees for Mount Sinai Church. So that was after all these years, the church property came into possession of families of the people who had been members there. But then a very strange thing happened a couple of years later. This was in 1955. And I think an important context for this is 1955 is when Storr College was being closed. And with a lot of controversy about it. And Storr was, they were selling off surplus properties and liquidating a lot of properties at the time. And that's what seems to have happened here. Some people from Harpers Ferry, from the Black Free Will Baptist churches in Jefferson County, they were from 3 different churches, came into court here with a prominent Leesburg lawyer, Wilbur Hall. And this is somebody say something about him. If not, maybe they should have. He, according to some accounts, he was, should we say, ethically challenged and not above getting some consideration for this, because obviously he himself didn't have an interest in it. But he helped basically to put it bluntly, the property was stolen from the families by the people in the Harpers Ferry Free Will Baptist meeting. Now, there was a long history of this in the Free Will Baptist. Nathan Brackett, who I mentioned from New England, was in a lot of controversies with some of the Black Free Will Baptist churches in West Virginia. There was a fellow named Reverend Dungy. There was supposed to be an event about, which was canceled at the museum in Winchester, which I was very anxious to see. He got in a big fight with them because he said that the New England Free Will Baptists that the local Black churches had built these churches and raised the money to build them. And then the Free Will Baptists from New England sold off the churches and sent the money back north. So I can't tell you the truth of it, but this is, you read the West Virginia newspapers in the 1880s in that period, and this is what was being charged. Now here, they came in, and it was pretty underhanded on the surface of it. You're supposed to have a legal notice. Like I mentioned in 1947, they did a legal notice in the papers, published 4 weeks in a row. They told the court that this was done. Wilbur Hall told the court this was done, but I couldn't find it anywhere. And I went through all the papers for that period, the surrounding period. No, plenty of other ads for legal sales and auctions, but none of this. You say, well, what does the court file say? Well, the court file happens to be missing. It's gone. No one knows where it is. So we don't actually know, but what makes it particularly galling and offensive is that this happened within 2 days. They were in court with this within 2 days of the last burial in that cemetery. They did not mention the fact that there was, as far as we can see in any of the proceedings that we have, that this cemetery was still an active cemetery. So they must have gone in, even though we don't know because the file's missing, but they would have had to say this property is no longer being used, it's not active. Therefore, it should be handed over to us and we can dispose of it as we wish. But it was being used at the time. So it was transferred to them, to a trustee, H.H. Winters, who was a pretty well-known guy in that area. He had been involved in a lot of business organizations. He taught at Storer College, respectable citizen from everything I've seen. But he was appointed trustee, but really not appointed because they really hadn't filed the papers for a couple of years. And then he died. And then his family came in and said, well, he intended to give it to us. So the court gave it to them, and then they turned around and sold it and kept the money. So that's how the cemetery ended up in private hands. There's a lot more to this story, I'm sure, to be found out, but I haven't been able to figure it out yet. I'm still trying.
We have a question about the showing some of the cleanup pictures.
Yeah. So exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, this is a good segue into that. So anyway, it was sold off in 1961 into private hands, and then was sold once since then. And the current owners who've owned it since in the 1990s have just basically trashed the place. They at one point they were. It's a real soap opera. I'm not going to get into it. At one point, they did take care of it and discovered a lot of grave markers and dug some up that were buried, in the ground, because a lot of the markers, there had been flooding there and it disappeared. But then they ended up, not taking care of it. And in fact, even, like I said, putting a hog pen on. You saw that picture. Can we transfer me to screen sharing?
Yeah, so you can.
Am I able to do it? Okay.
We should be able to do it.
Okay.
Okay.
So it had not been taken care of for a number of years. You saw in the earlier slides how there had been a neighbor had cleaned it up, cut down trees in the brush in 2019. And then the owner called the county on her and said she was just destroying gravestones, which was not true as far as I know. And the county came in and issued a stop work order. They got sort of taken for a ride on this thing. So then it became all overgrown again. We organized almost exactly a year ago, April 10th of last year, a cleanup And we got, after a great deal of effort, I made contact with the owner and he authorized us to,
Can you expand?
gave us permission. What's it doing? I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sure what I did or didn't do, but okay. Well, is that thing showing up? Okay, anyway, but that, the previous slide that I showed was sort of before and after the cleanup. This was mostly families, Claudette's family, extended family, a lot of Timbers were there, and some of the neighbors helped out on this as well. So that, the day before we did it, this picture on the left, and the day after we did it is the picture on the right. This is, you see Ed Bard there up front here. Other people, this is during the cleanup. This is some neighbors, Daniel Cooper, I mentioned, cousin, families down there, brought a trailer over. That's stuff that was cleaned out, just in that little area. There's Claudette and family. Some of them are on today. I think Taylor is on. It's just more, that's Timbers and Lewis's and everybody else. And in the middle is Ken Fleming. He's the guy that found Private Timbers gravestone. Had actually dug it out of the ground and was going in there for years to maintain it and keep it clean and putting a flag out on it. Again, that's more of it after the cleanup and a year ago, last April. This is the view in just now, right now. In fact, this is yesterday. You see, we did some cleaning of the gravestones, and this just happened. The William Parris, the gravestone in the middle is tipped over. That just happened within the past week or two, apparently, according to the neighbor. So maybe we don't know what, if it was loose before. Maybe an animal knocked it over. Some kids knocked it over. This was last year, the neighbor, Chris, who lives to the north of there, who's been looking after, the reason it's maintained is he's been weed whacking and trimming. And so that it still looks effective, essentially like it looked after we cleaned it up a year ago. But this was a tree that we knew it was in a danger thing, and it fell down and busted his fence. This is the view. This is, again, these were pictures yesterday. This is what right now, before all the weeds have grown up again, you can actually see, if you look closely, the burial ground from the street. And just to give you an idea, the cleanup, the solution, which I've been using, called D2, which is approved by Arlington National Cemetery and the Park Service. Ken Fleming told me about this. This is what it does to the headstones. And if you notice, all of them look much whiter and cleaner now than they were when we went in there. So it's great stuff. I'm a walking advertisement for it. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
Okay.
Nancy, do you have a question?
Well, first, Gilbert, you just have such a tremendous amount of material on Private Timbers. I was very impressed, very impressed. But I thought you should tell more of this. You told a little bit of the story of how his grave was really the impetus for starting this whole project, was it not? And say more about Ken and the irony of Ken.
Yes, the irony of Ken. Ken Fleming, the guy who found the grave, is well known in this county as an active member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. A lot of people hear that and say, boo down. He has great respect for
You need to
veterans.
unmute yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Did people on Zoom hear that or not? Okay, I was saying
Yeah.
Ken Fleming, who we spoke, who found the, when he actually went in there and found Private Timbers' grave, uncovered it, and went there every year and put an American flag out there on Memorial Day, is an active member of Sons of Confederate Veterans. Now, a lot of people, want nothing to do with them. We should not honor Confederate veterans. I mean, Ken's view is all veterans should be honored, and these are our ancestors. And he went in there and did this. He went in there and did something no one else had done.
Yeah, yeah.
Because most people didn't even know this was there. Not asking for any credit, not publicity, nothing, just did it. And I think Ken deserves a lot of thanks for that. And the families thanked him
Yeah,
at the
Yeah.
cleanup day.
absolutely.
I actually got a chance to shake his hand because that's the first time I actually met him and actually shook his hand to thank him because I had no idea that I had a relative that was in the Civil War. And so this is actually, how this whole initiative in so many ways got started. I didn't know about the cemetery. I had an aunt that lived, about a half a mile down the road from this cemetery, but I knew nothing about this area. And I have learned so much. And I'm still learning because, I'm finding, as I do my research, I'm finding connections to other people, the Beaners, the Hogans, the, even Claudette's side of the family, because I believe that we have a relationship in some way.
We're cousins somehow.
We're cousins, right? That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
We're cousins.
You haven't found one for me yet, have you?
Not yet. I'm still looking.
We're working on it. Yeah.
But it's quite interesting, and I'm hopeful that when I start looking at some of the 1950 census, I'll be able to see a little bit more of how people, where they ended up at after leaving, the Lovettsville area. But I so hope that we're able to get possession of this sacred area, restore it, and just bring some much long overdue dignity and respect to every individual who is interned there, in that space. And, I'm so looking forward to being able to be a part of that.
Well, I think those are very appropriate concluding remarks, unless somebody has something else they want to ask. We'll be here afterwards if people want to talk. Thank you, Gilbert, for that. That sums it up very nicely.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Claudette.
No, you're welcome.
Thank you all for being here.
It was a pleasure.
And there are, on their website, LovettsvilleHistoricalSociety.org, there are many stories about Mount Sinai. Just put in Sinai in the search engine. And a lot of articles by Claudette on the families, the history of the cemetery, what's happening with the county, the Board of Supervisors. And hopefully, next issue, we'll have some news from the county.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lori, you want to say something, Lori, or are you? Okay.
Okay.
Okay, on that note, we'll conclude. Stay tuned in the newsletter and the website, and we'll hope to see many of you back on May 15th. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.